Today we're looking at two aircraft that quietly marked the end of an era for the US Navy: the Grumman F2F and the Grumman F3F. The F3F, in particular, has a distinction that tends to surprise people. It would become the last biplane fighter to fully enter US service, and its time in that role was brief. But brief doesn't mean unimportant. These biplanes mattered. Both were built for aircraft carriers, and they became a working classroom for naval aviation. Many pilots learned their trade on machines like these. Some carried that experience into World War II, while others stayed in the training pipeline to prepare the next wave. Just as importantly, the F2F and F3F helped the Navy sharpen the early building blocks of carrier fighter tactics, back when the service was still learning what modern air combat at sea was going to look like. And you can see that moment before camouflage and combat took over in the paint. They weren't headline makers, but they shaped the people and procedures that would be. In the 1930s, Navy fighters didn't hide. The F2F and F3F wore bright yellow wings, polished silver fuselages, and trim in bold squadron colors, a kaleidoscope that could make a deck look festive. Up close, they looked more like aerobatic machines than military hardware. It fit the period: peacetime routines, fleet exercises, and public confidence all overlapping in one snapshot. That's why these Grumman biplanes have stayed so recognizable. When people picture interwar American naval aviation, this is the quintessential image of 1930s US military aircraft, right before subdued paint and wartime urgency replaced the shine. Bright wings, silver bodies, and colored chevrons weren't just decoration. They were the Navy's way of saying this was still a modern service, despite tight budgets. That shine also masks something less glamorous. In 1932, the Navy was operating under tight budget restraints. Without the gift of foresight, the Bureau of Aeronautics looked for practical ways to manage costs, and one obvious target was airframes lost to training accidents or mechanical failures. Carrier aviation added a twist. A land-based trainer that went down was usually a write-off. A carrier aircraft that ditched could, in theory, be recovered if it stayed afloat long enough. That idea had been sparked at the end of the 1920s by the Hall Aluminium Company's XFH-1. The airplane itself disappointed during its 1929 evaluations, but its all-metal, watertight structure could keep the airframe floating for a considerable time after ditching, and that caught the Bureau's attention. As a stopgap, the Navy fitted rapidly inflatable flotation bags to various aircraft. They technically worked, but their real effectiveness was marginal at best. So the Bureau kept pushing for a better answer: a watertight flotation compartment built into the fuselage from the start. By the early 1930s, that requirement was part of the ongoing discussions with Grumman, and it would shape what came next. It wasn't glamorous engineering, but it promised fewer lost airplanes and fewer dollars. Even before the two-seat Grumman FF1 entered production, and even as the Boeing F4B was only just entering service, the Navy was already looking for a replacement. Grumman's proposal, known internally as the G8, was a small, single-seat biplane fighter with an enclosed cockpit and retractable landing gear similar to the FF1. Power was to come from a 625-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1535-44 Twin Wasp Jr. Two features mattered most: a watertight fuselage compartment to help the aircraft stay afloat after ditching, and a fully adjustable horizontal stabilizer so the pilot could trim in all flight conditions. On November 2, 1932, the Bureau of Aeronautics ordered one prototype as the XF2F1. Later that month, Grumman moved to new facilities at Farmingdale, New York, and construction began. The structure was aluminum, the fuselage was a semi-monocoque shell skinned in aluminum, while the wings and control surfaces remained fabric-covered. The fuselage measured 21 feet 3 inches, and the landing gear retracted into the fuselage just forward of the lower wing. The prototype was completed in October 1933 and first flew on October 9th. It was delivered to NAS Anacostia on October 18th for trials. Performance looked strong, about 229 miles per hour top speed and roughly 3,080 feet per minute in climb. The flaw was stability. The short fuselage produced poor directional stability, and the aircraft could enter unintentional spins, an issue that lingered. The Navy asked for practical changes: a smaller diameter cowling with blisters over the rocker arms, oil cooler and intake modifications, including an intake change from square to round, a large antenna mast ahead of the vertical fin, and a telescopic gun sight. With those changes made, the test program continued, and on May 17, 1934, the Navy ordered 54 production aircraft as the F4F. The prototype stayed in service until 1938, when it was written off in an Anacostia accident. The first production F4F arrived on January 28, 1935, with a P&W R153572 engine, further cowling and canopy tweaks, a revised carburetor intake, and deletion of the spine antenna mast. Armament was 2.30 caliber machine guns, with provision for 2 110-pound bombs under the wings. From here, the F4F settled into a carrier routine. In service, the F4F's life was not glamorous, but it was foundational. EF-2B was the first squadron to transition, followed by VF-3B, later redesignated VF-5 to match the hull number of its carrier, USS Yorktown. The type saw use with several squadrons, but it lived mainly on the big interwar decks, Lexington, Yorktown, and Ranger, with Ranger's F4Fs later transferring to USS Wasp. Most of the flying was routine: training sorties, exercises, and the Navy's fleet problems. The transcript describes the F4F as surprisingly rugged, able to tolerate rough handling from inexperienced pilots. Even so, it still showed the usual carrier weakness. The landing gear and tail hook could struggle with fast or rough recoveries. The watertight hull idea paid off where it mattered most. Several F4Fs ditched and stayed afloat long enough to be salvaged. One F4F from Yorktown went into the sea in 1938, was recovered, and kept flying until October 1941. For VF-2B's Flying Chiefs, the F4F was also an excellent gunnery platform. In 1938 and 1939, every aircraft in the squadron won back-to-back E awards in gunnery contests. Very few survive in the literature, too. The author says you can count on one hand the books that cover the F4F in detail. By the end of 1941, the F4F was out of frontline units, turning up mostly as trainers or dusty instructional airframes. No examples survive today, and not much has been written about them, setting the stage for the F4F. That successor, the F4F, would fare a little better, but its prototype program was anything but smooth. On October 15, 1934, the Navy contracted Grumman to build a prototype of its Model 11, designated F4F-1. It was essentially an improved F4F, built to address the instability issues that had never fully gone away. The prototype looked like a stretched F4F because it was. The fuselage was lengthened by about 21 inches, the wingspan grew to 32 feet, and the basic layout stayed familiar. It first flew on March 20, 1935, with test pilot Jimmy Collins, and his initial reports were favorable. 2 days later came the disaster. During dive tests, Collins pulled out sharply at 8,000 feet. The aircraft broke apart. The transcript says the pullout was later estimated at around 14 G, forces the airframe couldn't handle, and Collins was killed. A second prototype followed, externally similar, but with reinforcements to the lower wing fuselage fittings and engine mounts. It was lost almost as quickly, this time to an unrecoverable flat spin during spin trials. Test pilot Lee Gelbach survived by bailing out at roughly 2,000 feet. Prototype number 3 was built within weeks, helped by salvageable parts from the second airframe. It added an enlarged rudder to improve spin recovery and kept the reinforcements. Grumman also planned production changes, an updated R1535-84 engine and a Hamilton standard variable pitch two-blade propeller. Those updates added about 43 pounds, so the third prototype carried a lead-filled steel tube bolted to the crankcase to simulate the weight during testing. Flight testing was given top priority, and only 2 months passed between the third prototype's first flight and the Navy ordering 54 F3F-1s in August 1935. Ironically, this final prototype ended up with one of the longest service lives of the type, still working as an advanced fighter trainer in 1943. And once production aircraft arrived, the Navy quickly found new problems to solve again in the fleet. Deliveries of the F3F-1 began in 1936, and the fleet quickly found structural weakness. During the summer of 1936, the type was restricted to maneuvers pulling no more than 6G. Testing and reinforcements followed, and as the fixes proved out, the limits climbed again, eventually up to about 9G, giving the later F3Fs a reputation for aerobatic stunts once the early weakness was addressed. The next step also fed directly into the Wildcat story. Grumman had an order for the F4F1, but when Brewster won a contract for its F2A monoplane, Grumman had to pivot. The Navy allowed a modern monoplane program and biplane updates as a stopgap. That led to the F3F2, converted from the final F3F1 on the line. It took an 865 horsepower Wright R1820G5 Cyclone with a 2-speed supercharger, a redesigned nose, and a larger 3-blade propeller. First flown in July 1936, it reached about 255 miles per hour and a 30,200-foot ceiling. But trials dragged on due to carburetor problems, oil overheating, and poor airflow that caused carbon monoxide buildup in the cockpit. Once corrected, the Navy ordered 81 F3F-2s on March 23, 1937. The finalized version used an R1820-22, rated around 950 horsepower for takeoff, delivered about 256 miles per hour, raised the ceiling to 32,400 feet, and increased range from 882 to 975 miles. Armament stayed simple, 1.30 and 1.50, with provision for approximately 110-pound bombs under the wings. In 1938, delays with both the F2A and F4F created an aircraft shortage, so Grumman refined the biplane one last time as the F3F-3. The changes included a redesigned wing leading edge, tighter cowling, deletion of cooling vents, and a revised windshield too. Aerodynamic cleanups and testing at Langley and the Naval Aircraft Factory produced 27 aircraft. By 1940–41, they were being replaced by monoplanes, leaving the remaining biplanes to train pilots and to appear in the film Dive Bomber, a neat reminder of how quickly 1937's state-of-the-art could look dated by 1941. By 1941, the Navy's biplane fighters were fading from the front line, but the F3F avoided obscurity for one reason: the Gulfhawks. Gulf Oil and its chief pilot, Al Williams, wanted a tougher, faster show aircraft, and Grumman delivered the Gulfhawk II, the G-22, by blending F2F and F3F and stripping away anything military. Armament, bomb racks, and arrestor gear came off. A custom cowling went on, and the engine was a Wright R1820, rated around 1,000 horsepower, modified to allow up to 30 minutes of inverted flight. In 1936, it could do just over 290 miles per hour. Williams flew it nationwide from 1936 to 1948, then took it to Europe. In Germany, Ernst Udet became the only other person permitted to fly it. In return, Williams flew a Messerschmitt Bf 109, becoming the first American to do so. During World War II, the Gulfhawk toured military bases and helped inspire new pilots. Later, after Williams received a Gulfhawk 4, he presented the Gulfhawk 2 to the Smithsonian, and it remains on display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Not every offshoot survived. Gulfhawk 3, a modified F3F, was lost after a fuel pump failure sent it into the Florida Everglades, and it was scrapped. Even so, the type endures. 4 F3F2s survive today, along with a replica G-32A. These aircraft marked the end of Navy biplanes, strengthened Grumman's relationship with the service, and set the table for the monoplane era, starting with the F4F Wildcat, a story for another day.